5 months after Jack and Lily Sullivan vanished. Their stepfather, Daniel Martel, says he continues to search for answers and cooperate with police. That included when cadaver dogs recently came to his property.
I come home and the dogs were already, on scene, and they were there for about an hour before I got there. I didn't know the exact day when the arrival was going to happen. So it was even a surprise to me, but at the end of the day, everything's ruled out there, and I hope this speculation, turns elsewhere.
They brought the dogs trained to find what people cannot, combed lanes and woods for miles, and still came up with no answer. 5 months after Lily and Jack vanished, the search is alive, but the silence is louder than ever. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell now so you don't miss any verified updates on this case and others. Every new detail can change everything. Stepdad Daniel Martel remains in the frame of this investigation, cooperating visibly and continuing to search 5 months after the children's disappearance. That fact matters for how the case is perceived and how investigators proceed. When a family member stays engaged publicly, gives access to property, and participates in searches, it changes the texture of the inquiry. It provides investigators with additional entry points for evidence, narrows timelines investigators must reconstruct, and shapes the public narrative that can sometimes obscure the painstaking work behind the scenes. Daniel's ongoing cooperation is both a procedural detail and an emotional signal to the community. Whatever questions remain, he is presenting himself as available for investigators and as someone still desperate to find the children. For police, a cooperating family member is not the end of inquiry but a participant who can help reconstruct the mundane movements that fill out any missing person file. His presence at searches, his answers to follow-up questions, and his willingness to submit to questioning and voluntary actions mitigate some immediate suspicions but do not close the file. Investigators still test every claim and follow every lead, because cooperation does not replace corroboration. The case of Lily and Jack shows how cooperation, presence at searches, and public statements all become part of the evidentiary fabric. They must be weighed alongside hard forensic data, footage, and corroborated witness statements. That cooperation was especially evident when human remains detection teams were flown in from British Columbia to search Martel's property and nearby woods. Cadaver dogs are not the same as tracking dogs used in the first frantic hours after a missing person report. These are highly trained animals conditioned to detect chemical markers associated with human decomposition. Their deployment signals that investigators are methodically exhausting specialized resources, and that they are willing to revisit conclusions and revisit terrain as techniques and leads evolve. When those dogs arrived, they were scheduled to sweep both open and concealed places, under decks, inside trailers, along pipeline corridors, and in the thick brush that often hides more than it reveals. Bringing teams from another province is a logistical decision that speaks to the seriousness of the effort. Handlers, their canine partners, and coordination with local investigators all had to be managed to ensure searches were conducted following recognized protocols. Those protocols include how dogs are handled, how areas are grid searched, how potential indications are recorded, and how subsequent forensic follow-up is organized. For families, the sight of specialized teams arriving can provoke both hope and dread. Hope because every tool is being used, dread because the presence of cadaver dogs often implies investigators are considering the most serious outcomes. The deployment took place during the week of September 22nd and covered roughly 40 kilometers of ground over the course of the operation. 40 kilometers is more than a figure. It's a practical description of the scale and difficulty faced by search teams. That distance was not a single straight line but a mosaic of trails, ridgelines, pipeline clearings, steep banks, and the yard and outbuildings of the Lansdowne property. Covering that much terrain requires logistical planning. Teams are assigned lanes, GPS tracks are logged to ensure coverage, and handlers rotate to keep dogs effective. The length of the search also reflects the investigators' desire to be thorough. They didn't merely walk familiar paths. They checked intersecting trails and lesser-used hollows where scent and evidence might linger. The 3-day window of canine deployment was tightly paced. Handlers and the dogs worked in relays to keep searches methodical rather than haphazard. The ground they covered included known points of interest: the family home, the trailer, the pipeline corridor where chain link movement could show a path, and the areas where prior clues had been found. To say the teams covered about 40 kilometers is to acknowledge the scale of the investigative effort and the physical limits facing even the most determined searchers. Despite the intense effort over those days, the dogs did not indicate the presence of human remains. That absence is significant but not conclusive in either direction. Canine detection of decomposition is influenced by many variables. Environmental conditions such as wind, rain, and temperature, the time elapsed since an incident, whether a body was concealed or moved, and the degree to which the site had been disturbed by prior searches, volunteer traffic, or animals. Dogs are extraordinarily sensitive tools, but they are not infallible detectors that render a simple yes or no verdict. Investigators understand this nuance and have consistently framed negative canine results as a reduction of probability in the specific areas searched at the specific times the dogs were there, not a global finding that rules out remains anywhere. In other words, a no indication on the Lansdowne property and its immediate approaches reduces the likelihood that remains were present in those exact places at that moment, but it does not categorically exclude other possibilities. Remains in other sites, earlier removal, or disruption by animal activity could be consistent with the negative result. The RCMP's public messaging about the canine deployment deliberately reflected that nuance, stressing that specialized searches were one tool among many and that work would continue until investigators had corroborated physical data, forensic results, and digital evidence. Search teams worked specific zones with particular attention to the Lansdowne property itself, the surrounding woods, and the intersecting pipeline that cuts through the area. Pipelines, because they create linear clearings through brush and trees, often serve as practical travel corridors and have been relevant in many rural searches. Investigators focused on those intersecting trails because any movement away from the property would likely have utilized such clearings, and because prior clues, fabric fragments, prints, or other items had been located near or along these routes in earlier parts of the investigation. The campaign included searches inside Martel's trailer and even under the deck, areas that could hide small items or concealment. Interior searches require different techniques than open-air sweeps. Enclosed spaces have airflows that trap odors differently, and forensic sampling inside shelters demands controlled entry and careful documentation to avoid contamination. Investigators reportedly executed these searches methodically, photographing, cataloging, and collecting items when necessary to preserve chain of custody. The staged approach, property interior, immediate exterior, then linear corridors and remote hollows, reflects a typical progression when investigators combine local intelligence with forensic priorities. During the search, a dog handler engaged Martel with questions about what he recalled doing the Thursday before the disappearance, an example of how handlers and investigators will probe timelines to clarify small but potentially pivotal details. That encounter illustrates a common investigative method. Handler observations and preliminary questioning often focus on specific, verifiable details. Who entered the property, which doors were open, what items were moved, that can be checked against device records, witnesses, or footage. Daniel's response, according to public summaries, remained consistent. He maintained that the Thursday in question had been ordinary and denied involvement in the children's disappearance. For investigators, such denials are data points to be weighed against physical and digital evidence. Denial or affirmation by a family member informs the direction of follow-up interviews, the issuance of subpoenas for records, and the prioritization of areas for renewed searches. It does not, by itself, resolve the question of what happened. Rather, it joins the mosaic of statements and material evidence that investigators must reconcile. Staff Sergeant Rob McCammon has emphasized publicly that the investigation will continue until answers emerge. That official commitment matters in two ways. First, it reassures the public and the family that the RCMP are maintaining momentum and that resources will be allocated as long as leads warrant. Second, it communicates to potential witnesses that their information remains important even months later. Timing is often crucial in prompting people to remember or re-examine recordings, receipts, or casual observations that may have seemed irrelevant at first but become meaningful under scrutiny. McCammon's message also serves an operational purpose. It gives investigators space to keep inquiries active without being compelled into premature disclosures that might compromise legal proceedings. In complex cases, public patience is as important as public tips. Investigators must ensure they follow evidentiary standards that will stand up under legal examination. Authorities have stated cadaver dogs could return to the area if new information suggests previously missed evidence or points to other locations requiring canine attention. That conditional stance keeps investigative tools in play and creates a framework in which searches are iterative rather than finite. Investigations into missing persons, especially in rural environments, are rarely linear. New tips, uncovered footage, or forensic results can reopen questions and redirect resources. The possibility of returning canine teams underscores the ongoing nature of the work. Negative findings do not end inquiry, and the investigative apparatus remains responsive to credible leads. What does this all mean right now? No remains were found during the 3-day canine search, so at present the case remains an active missing persons investigation rather than a closed recovery inquiry. Investigators have used specialized resources and covered extensive ground without yielding conclusive physical evidence, which both narrows and complicates the set of plausible explanations. The focused questioning of Martel and others underscores how timeline inconsistencies and minute details can guide detectives toward or away from specific theories. And the public posture of investigators, committed, procedural, and open to returning canines if warranted, signals that the RCMP are treating this as an ongoing priority. If you have anything that could help, a dashcam clip, a doorbell video, images of the area from the relevant time frame, or any observation that now seems important, preserve it and contact the investigators handling the file. Do not alter or publicly post potentially relevant material. Pass it to law enforcement so it can be cataloged and used meaningfully. The search continues because investigators are still following threads that could yet produce answers, video matches to small physical clues, new tips that place people or vehicles in specific places at specific times, or forensic results that corroborate one line of inquiry over another. This moment is a test of methodical patience and investigative rigor. The arrival of cadaver dogs, the days of painstaking ground coverage, the interior searches, and the follow-up questioning are all parts of a deliberate process designed to turn rumor into evidence and to find the truth, whatever it may be. Staff Sergeant McCammon's promise that the investigation will continue stands as a reminder. Law enforcement will not rest until they can provide clarity to a grieving family and a concerned community. Hold space for Lily and Jack. Hold pressure on the investigators to follow every credible lead. And hold faith that diligent, patient work, not speculation, is the way we find answers. We will report verified developments as investigators confirm them and explain clearly what each new piece of evidence means for the search.